Emily stood in the small kitchen of their Michigan home, the sunset casting a golden glow through the faded curtains that had hung there too long. Her hand stirred the pot of pumpkin soup, the sweet aroma rising with a hint of cinnamon she'd sprinkled in. A recipe David once called a masterpiece, back when love was new. A faint smile touched her lips. 10 years ago, David would have slipped into the kitchen right about now, wrapped his arms around her waist, and whispered that no one made this soup like she did. These days, he'd just sit in front of the TV, waiting for her to call out that dinner was ready, as if she were part of the furniture. Useful, familiar, but no longer worth a second glance. She paused, her spoon resting against the pot's edge, and looked down at her hands. They were rough now, worn from years of washing dishes, folding laundry, and tending to a life no one seemed to notice. 10 years. A whole decade had slipped by since that first date when David had shown up with a cheap silver necklace, its tiny heart pendant dangling as he grinned and said, "Wear this, Em. It's not much, but it's yours." She'd laughed, slipping it around her neck, feeling like the luckiest woman alive. They'd sat in a cramped apartment back then, eating takeout on the floor, dreaming of a house, a family, a future where they'd never stop seeing each other. Now, the house was theirs, a modest 2-bedroom with creaky floors and a mortgage that kept David at the office late. The dreams had faded into routines. He'd come home, toss his keys on the counter, and mumble a tired hey before sinking into the couch. She'd ask about his day, and he'd nod, maybe grunt a few words, his eyes already on the screen. She'd stopped expecting more, but the silence gnawed at her. When had it started? When had she become invisible? She turned to the counter, where a small wooden jewelry box sat tucked beside the spice rack. With a hesitant hand, she lifted the lid. There it was. The necklace, its chain tangled and dull, buried under a decade of dust. She pulled it free, holding it up to the light. The heart pendant caught a flicker of the sunset, and for a moment she could hear David's laugh, see his young, eager face promising her the world. "When did I stop mattering?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the simmer of the soup. The question hung there, unanswered, heavy as the years piling up behind her. She tucked the necklace back into the box and closed it with a soft click. Tonight would be different, she told herself. David's mother, Margaret, and his sister, Sarah, were coming over for dinner, a rare family gathering she'd suggested to break the monotony. She'd spent the day planning it, imagining their faces when they tasted the meal she'd poured her heart into. Maybe David would notice. Maybe he'd look at her the way he used to, even just for a second. The thought sparked a fragile hope in her chest, like a match struck in the dark. She moved to the oven, checking the chicken roasting inside, her mother's recipe, fragrant with herbs and lemon, a dish she'd perfected over the years. It was more than food to her. It was a piece of herself, a quiet offering she hoped they'd see. She smoothed her apron, glancing at the clock. They'd be here soon. She could already picture Margaret's sharp eyes scanning the table, Sarah's easy chatter filling the room, and David, well, she hoped he'd at least sit up straighter, maybe say something kind. The front door creaked open, and David's voice drifted in, low and tired. "Em, I'm home." She turned, wiping her hands on a towel, forcing a smile. He shuffled into the kitchen, his tie loosened, his dark hair mussed from running a hand through it too many times. He glanced at the stove, then at her. "Smells good," he said, the words flat, automatic. She waited for more, a compliment, a question, anything. But he just nodded and headed for the living room. The match in her chest flickered out. She leaned against the counter, staring at the pot as the soup bubbled softly. This was her life now, cooking meals that went unnoticed, asking questions that got no answers, wearing a smile that hid the ache. But tonight, she thought, tonight could change that. She straightened up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Margaret and Sarah would arrive any minute, and she'd make this dinner perfect. She'd give them something they couldn't ignore. She turned the heat down on the stove, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart, and told herself it wasn't too late to be seen. The doorbell rang, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet. Emily took a deep breath, smoothing her apron one last time. She crossed the kitchen, her steps light but deliberate, and opened the door to let the family in. Margaret stood there first, her silver hair pulled back tight, her lips pressed into a thin line as she gave Emily a quick nod. Sarah followed, all bright eyes and chatter, a covered dish in her hands. "Hey, Em, brought a little something to add to the table," she said with a grin. Emily smiled back, her voice soft. "Can't wait to try it." David emerged from the living room, offering a half-hearted wave. The three of them moved past her, their voices overlapping as they settled around the dining table. Emily lingered by the door for a moment, watching them, the weight of 10 years pressing down a little harder. She closed the door and turned back to the kitchen, her resolve hardening. Tonight, she'd make them see her. She had to. The kitchen hummed with the soft clatter of plates as Emily pulled the roasted chicken from the oven, its golden skin glistening under the light, the air thick with the scent of rosemary and lemon. She'd spent hours on it, rubbing the herbs just right, squeezing the citrus until her fingers stung. Because this wasn't just dinner, it was her mother's recipe. A piece of her soul laid out on a platter, a silent plea to be noticed. She set it on the counter, wiping her hands on her apron, and let herself imagine David's face lighting up, his voice warm with a, "Wow, Em, you've outdone yourself." She clung to that image, fragile as it was, and carried the dish to the dining room where the chatter was already rising. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her posture stiff, her silver hair catching the glow of the chandelier. Sarah perched beside her, animated as ever, her laughter cutting through the room like a bell. David slumped in his chair, scrolling his phone, barely glancing up as Emily approached. She set the chicken down carefully, the platter thudding softly against the wood, and stepped back, waiting. Sarah's dish, a small tray of brownies, sat nearby, its chocolate scent mingling with the savory warmth of the meal Emily had labored over. "Looks like a feast tonight," Sarah said, grinning as she nudged her brownies closer to the center. Margaret leaned forward, her sharp eyes flicking over the table. "Smells decent, I suppose," she said, her tone cool, like she was grading a test Emily hadn't studied for. Emily forced a smile, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. "Thanks, Margaret. I hope you like it." She glanced at David, hoping he'd chime in, maybe say something to bridge the gap, but he just nodded absently, his thumb still swiping the screen. The hope in her chest tightened into a knot. She turned back to the kitchen for the soup, ladling it into bowls with a steady hand, though her mind churned. They'd see the effort soon enough, she'd make sure of it. Balancing the tray, she returned to the table and slid a bowl in front of each of them. First Margaret, then Sarah, then David. "Pumpkin soup," she said softly, with a little cinnamon, "like my mom used to make." Sarah spooned a bite right away, nodding. "Nice touch, Em." It wasn't much, but it was something, and Emily clung to it as she took her seat. The meal began, forks clinking against plates, voices overlapping. Sarah launched into a story about her latest baking triumph, her hands waving as she described a cake that had won some office contest. Margaret listened intently, her thin lips curling into a rare smile. "You've always had a knack for these things, Sarah," she said, cutting into the chicken without a second glance at Emily. David chuckled at Sarah's tale, finally setting his phone down, and took a bite of the chicken. Emily watched him chew, her breath held, waiting for that spark of recognition. He swallowed, nodded, and said, "Good stuff," before reaching for his soup. "Good stuff." 2 words, flat as the table beneath them, and then he was back to Sarah's story. Emily's fork hovered over her plate. She should have been used to this by now, the way they talked around her, the way her efforts dissolved into the background. But tonight it stung deeper, a needle threading through years of quiet wounds. She speared a piece of chicken, the meat tender under her knife, and ate slowly, tasting the care she'd put into it. If they wouldn't say it, she'd feel it for herself. That was enough, wasn't it? Then it happened. Sarah reached for the chicken, slicing off a piece with a flourish. "This is amazing," she said, her voice bright. "I mean, really hits the spot." Margaret nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "You're right, Sarah. You've outdone yourself with this spread." The words landed like a slap, sharp and sudden. Emily froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. David looked up, confused for a split second, then shrugged and kept eating. Sarah blinked, her grin faltering. "Oh, this isn't mine," she started, but Margaret waved her off. "Nonsense. It's got your touch all over it." The room tilted. Emily's chest tightened, her breath shallow as the weight of it sank in. They thought Sarah had made the chicken. Her chicken. The one she'd spent hours perfecting. The one she'd hoped would pull them out of their indifference. And no one, not David, not Margaret, not even Sarah, bothered to correct it. The chatter picked up again, Sarah's laugh ringing out, Margaret's praise piling on, and David just sat there, eating her food like it was nothing, like she was nothing. She set her fork down, the clink lost in the noise. Her hands trembled as she pushed her chair back, the legs scraping the floor. "Excuse me," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, and stood. David glanced at her, his brow creasing. "You okay, Em?" She nodded, lips pressed tight, and slipped away from the table. The hallway stretched before her, dim and quiet, a refuge from the storm brewing inside. She made it to the bathroom, shutting the door with a soft click, and leaned against it, her breath hitching. The tears came fast, hot against her cheeks. She pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling the sound, and stared at the tiled floor. It was just a misunderstanding, she told herself. Just a silly mix-up over a piece of chicken. But it wasn't. It was 10 years of cooking dinners no one thanked her for, 10 years of fading into the wallpaper while they laughed and lived around her. She slid down to the floor, her apron crumpling, and let the weight of it all press her into the silence. The bathroom door clicked shut, sealing Emily in with the hum of her own ragged breathing. She sank to the cold tile floor, her back pressed against the wood, her apron bunching around her knees. Tears streamed down her face, hot and relentless, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth to keep the sobs from spilling out. The mirror above the sink loomed over her, reflecting a woman she barely recognized. Eyes red, cheeks streaked, a stranger drowning in a decade of quiet hurt. "It's just a chicken," she whispered, her voice cracking against the silence. Why does it hurt so much? But she knew why. It wasn't the chicken, not really. It was the weight of 10 years piling up, each unnoticed meal, each unanswered question, each moment she'd swallowed her voice to keep the peace. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, the tears smearing across her skin, and stared at the floor. The tiles blurred as her mind drifted back, pulling her into memories she'd buried under layers of routine. She saw David on their third date, his grin wide as he handed her that cheap silver necklace, the heart pendant glinting in the diner's dim light. "You're my everything, Em," he'd said, and she'd believed him. She saw them dancing in that tiny apartment, barefoot on the carpet, laughing as they tripped over boxes they hadn't unpacked. He'd looked at her then, really looked at her, like she was the only thing that mattered. When had that stopped? She traced the edges of the memory, searching for the moment it all shifted. Was it the first time he forgot her birthday, coming home late with a half-hearted, "Sorry, work was crazy"? Or the time Margaret had sighed at her across the table, muttering, "You're lucky David provides, dear. Not everyone can manage a house and a career." Or maybe it was Sarah, years ago, smirking when Emily mentioned wanting to write a book. "Oh, that's cute, Em, but who'd read it?" Each one a tiny cut, a conron she'd brushed off, until they'd stacked so high she couldn't breathe under them anymore. She pulled her knees to her chest, the apron's fabric damp against her skin. That chicken out there, the one she'd spent hours perfecting, the one they'd credited to Sarah, wasn't just a mistake. It was the last straw, the one that snapped the camel's back. She could see it now, clear as the tears drying on her face. She was that camel, trudging through a desert of their indifference, her spine bending under the load until it finally broke. 10 years of fading, of shrinking, of letting herself be erased, and for what? so they could laugh over a meal she'd poured her heart into, never knowing it was hers? The thought twisted inside her, sharp and bitter, but beneath it something else stirred, a flicker of anger, small but fierce. She wasn't nothing. She wasn't invisible. She'd built this life. Every dinner, every folded shirt, every smile she'd faked to keep them happy, and they didn't see it, didn't see her. Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms, and she shook her head, the motion slow at first, then sharper. "No," she murmured, the word tasting foreign on her tongue. "No more." She pushed herself up, legs shaky but steadying with each breath. The mirror caught her again, and this time she met her own gaze. Her eyes were still red, her face still flushed, but there was something new there. A spark, a resolve she hadn't felt in years. She reached for the sink, splashing cold water on her cheeks, letting it wash away the last of the tears. Her fingers lingered on her skin, tracing the lines time had carved, and she thought of her mother, how she'd stood in her own kitchen, strong and quiet, teaching Emily that soup recipe with a smile that said, "You're enough." Emily hadn't believed it then. She did now. "I'm not invisible," she said, louder this time, her voice echoing off the tiles. "Not anymore." The words settled into her bones, solid and real, and she straightened her shoulders. She could hear them out there. Sarah's laugh, Margaret's clipped tones, David's low hum of agreement. They were carrying on, oblivious, while she'd been breaking apart in here. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. Not ever. She smoothed her apron, the fabric cool against her palms, and took a deep breath. The anger was still there, simmering, but it wasn't wild. It was focused, a fire she could hold. She'd go back out there, not to cry, not to shrink, but to stand, to say something, to make them see her, even if it was just for a moment. She didn't know what would happen after that, whether David would blink awake from his haze, whether Margaret would scoff, whether Sarah would stumble over an apology. It didn't matter. What mattered was her voice, her presence, her refusal to fade any longer. Her hand found the doorknob, cool and firm under her grip. She turned it slowly, the click loud in the stillness, and stepped into the hallway. The dining room loomed ahead, the light spilling out, the voices sharper now. Her heart pounded, a steady drumbeat in her chest, but she didn't falter. She'd spent 10 years carrying their weight. Now it was their turn to carry hers. She lifted her chin, her steps soft but sure, and walked back toward the table, ready to break the silence that had held her too long. The hallway stretched before Emily like a tightrope, each step a test of the resolve burning in her chest. The dining room light spilled out ahead, warm and mocking, pulling her back toward the voices that had pushed her to the edge. Sarah's laugh rang out, bright and careless, followed by Margaret's clipped murmur of approval. David's low hum wove through it all, steady and indifferent. Emily's hand tightened on the doorknob she'd just left behind, then fell to her side. She wasn't retreating this time. She crossed the threshold, her apron swaying with her stride, and stopped at the edge of the table. The chatter paused, heads turning as she stood there, her shadow stretching across the hardwood. The roasted chicken sat in the center, half-carved, its golden skin torn apart like her patience. Sarah's brownies flanked it, untouched, a silent rival Emily hadn't asked for. She reached for the platter, her fingers brushing the warm ceramic, and lifted it with a force she didn't know she had. The thud as she set it down again, harder than necessary, cut through the room like a gunshot. Forks stilled, eyes widened, and for the first time that night, she had their attention. "I made this," she said, her voice trembling but clear, each word a stone dropped into the silence. "Not Sarah. Me." She locked eyes with David first, his brow creasing, his mouth parting as if to speak. She didn't wait. "And I'm tired of pretending it doesn't matter. 10 years, David, 10 years of dinners, of smiles, of holding this family together, and none of you see me." Her gaze shifted to Margaret, whose thin lips pursed tighter, and then to Sarah, whose grin faltered into something uneasy. David shifted in his chair, setting his fork down. "I didn't mean," he started, his voice soft, uncertain, but she cut him off. Her words spilling faster now, fueled by the fire she'd nursed in the bathroom. You never do. That's the problem. You don't mean to ignore me, to let me fade, but it still happens. And it hurts. Every damn day it hurts. Her chest heaved, the air thick with the weight of what she'd held back too long. She saw him flinch, his hand twitching toward his glass, but he didn't look away. Not this time. Margaret cleared her throat, her silver hair glinting as she tilted her head. Don't be dramatic, dear, she said, her tone sharp enough to slice through the tension. It's just a meal. No need to make a scene. The dismissal stung, a familiar barb, but Emily didn't shrink. She straightened, her hands steady now, and met Margaret's gaze head-on. It's not just a meal. It's me. My time, my effort, my heart, and you gave it to someone else without a second thought. You always do. Sarah fidgeted, her fingers twisting a napkin. I tried to say it wasn't mine, she stammered, her voice small, but Emily shook her head. It's not about you, Sarah. It's about all of you. I've been invisible here and I let it happen, but not anymore. Her eyes burned, not with tears this time, but with something fiercer, a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She reached up, her fingers finding the clasp of the old silver necklace David had given her all those years ago. It hung against her collarbone, a relic of a promise long faded. She unhooked it, the chain slipping through her fingers, and held it out, the tiny heart pendant swaying in the light. This used to mean something, she said, her voice dropping low, raw. You gave it to me, David, and said I was your everything. Now it's just dust, like me to you. She set it on the table, the soft clink echoing in the stunned silence. David stared at it, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or the ghost of the man he'd been. Margaret huffed, pushing her plate away. If you're done with your little tantrum, Emily, we can all move on. But Emily didn't budge. She stood there, rooted, her breath steadying as the weight of 10 years shifted, not gone but lighter, shared now. Sarah looked down, her hands still, and David, he didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her, his fork forgotten beside his plate. The room felt smaller, the air charged, and for once, Emily didn't feel like she was disappearing into it. She took a step back, her hands falling to her sides. I'm not asking for praise, she said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. I'm asking to be seen. That's all I've ever wanted. She turned, her apron brushing the chair, and walked toward the kitchen. Not to hide this time, not to cry, but to breathe. She'd said it, finally said it, and the world hadn't ended. The table behind her stayed quiet, the clatter of their easy ignorance replaced by a stillness she'd forced them to feel. She paused at the sink, her hands gripping the edge, the cool metal grounding her. Out there, she'd left a crack in the life she'd let them build around her, a crack she wasn't sure they'd mend, but one she wouldn't fill alone anymore. She heard a chair scrape, footsteps hesitating in the doorway, but she didn't turn, not yet. She'd stood up, and that was enough for now. The fire in her chest burned steady, a light she'd forgotten she could carry, and she let it warm her as the night stretched on. The kitchen was a quiet refuge, the hum of the refrigerator a soft anchor as Emily stood at the sink, her hands braced against the cool steel. The dining room behind her had fallen into an uneasy hush, the clatter of forks and easy laughter snuffed out by the weight of her words. She could still feel the echo of her own voice. I'm asking to be seen, ringing in her ears, a sound she'd buried for too long. The air felt lighter now, though her chest still carried the ache of 10 years. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a decade, she didn't need to know. She'd stood up, and that was enough. A chair scraped against the floor in the other room, the sound sharp in the stillness. She heard Margaret's voice, low and clipped, muttering something about overreactions as her footsteps retreated toward the front door. The latch clicked, and she was gone, leaving a void that didn't sting as much as Emily had expected. Sarah's voice followed, softer, hesitant. I'm sorry, Em. I didn't mean for it to... Well, you know... I'll call you tomorrow, okay? Her steps faded too, the door closing again, softer this time. Emily stayed where she was, staring at the sink, the water dripping slowly from the faucet like a metronome counting out the end of the night. David didn't leave. She could sense him still out there, his presence a quiet pull she'd always felt, even when he'd stopped feeling her. The floor creaked as he stood, his footsteps slow, uncertain, stopping at the kitchen doorway. She didn't turn, not yet. Her hands tightened on the sink's edge, grounding her as the silence stretched between them. He cleared his throat, a small, nervous sound she hadn't heard from him in years. "Em?" he said, his voice rough, like he was testing it after too long unused. "Can we talk?" She let the question hang there, the drip of the faucet marking time. Finally she turned, leaning against the counter, her arms crossed over her apron. He stood framed in the doorway, his tie loose, his dark hair falling into his eyes. The silver necklace lay in his hand, the heart pendant catching the light as he held it up, almost like an offering. "I didn't know," he said, his words halting. "I didn't see it. How much I'd let slip. I've been so caught up in work, in everything, that I forgot to look at you." Emily watched him, her gaze steady, searching his face for the man she'd fallen in love with. He was there, buried under layers of exhaustion and habit, but she wasn't sure if that was enough anymore. "It's not just tonight, David," she said, her voice low but firm. "It's every night, every day. I've waited for you to notice, to care, and you didn't. Not until I made you." Her words weren't sharp now, just true, and they settled between them like dust finding the floor. He stepped closer, his hand closing around the necklace. "I've been an idiot," he said, a faint crack in his voice. "I see that now. I got so used to you being here, being everything, that I stopped thinking about what it cost you. I'm sorry, Em. I don't know how to fix it, but I want to try." His eyes met hers, and for the first time in years they held, really held. Hers, no phone or distraction pulling him away. She saw guilt there, and something softer, something she'd missed. She didn't answer right away. She turned back to the sink, running her fingers under the cold water, letting it wash over her skin. "I don't need you to fix it," she said finally, her voice quiet, steady. "I needed you to see me. That's all I've ever wanted. Not praise, not promises, just you looking at me like I matter." She shut the water off, drying her hands on her apron, and faced him again. "I don't know if you can, but I'm not going back to being invisible. Not for you, not for anyone." He nodded, slow and heavy, the necklace still in his grip. "I don't want you to," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to see you, Em. I'll try. I'll do better, I promise." It wasn't grand, wasn't the sweeping vow of their younger days, but it was honest, and that was more than she'd had in a long time. She didn't know if she believed him yet, but she felt the shift, a crack in the wall they'd built, a sliver of light breaking through. She stepped past him, brushing his arm as she walked to the back door. The night air hit her face, cool and sharp as she stepped onto the porch. The stars stretched out above, faint against the suburban glow, and she breathed them in, her shoulders easing. David followed, stopping beside her, close but not touching. He held out the necklace, his hand trembling slightly. "Will you take it back?" he asked, his voice soft, uncertain. She looked at it, the tiny heart glinting in the moonlight, and shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "Maybe someday, but not tonight." He nodded, slipping it into his pocket, and they stood there, side by side, the silence between them different now, not heavy, not empty, but alive with possibility. She didn't need him to be her everything anymore. She was enough, had always been enough, and she'd carry that truth with her whether he caught up or not. The night stretched on, the crickets humming in the distance, and Emily felt a peace she hadn't known in years. For her, the most precious thing wasn't the necklace or his words. It was kindness, the kind that saw her when she'd been invisible too long. And tonight, she'd given that to herself. David reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers, and she let him hold it, just for a moment. It wasn't an ending, not a beginning either, just a step, small and fragile, into whatever came next.